Hi everybody. I'm back to talk about my second painting, and I believe I had showed you this image already in class. I really love this photograph of my dad with my niece, but I'm not in love with the fact that it's in their driveway and they have their car. And so I thought to rearrange that, take them, put them on my piece of paper, and then do a field of tulips behind them. I'm ready to start painting it. And there was something that just kept bothering me about this image. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized what bothers me is that Emma is facing away from my dad, and it's breaking up the relationship between them. And so what I've decided to do is decided to move him over. She's already drawn on my watercolor paper. So here is the painting. I've printed him out in black and white, and I've started playing around with where to place him. This helps me because I've already started this. It helps me figure out where to draw him in. So once I make that decision, I don't want him blocking her, but I want her facing where he's pointing. This creates more of a relationship between, and to me, that's what this painting is about. It's about the relationship between my dad and my niece. So once I get him drawn in, I'll be back and we'll start talking about painting. I'm going to start this painting by beginning with the background, the sky. It's a summer sky with big billowy clouds, so I'm choosing to do wet into wet. I'm wetting down the sky area, and then I'm dropping in a little bit of phthalo blue with just a little bit of cerulean blue in it, just to tone down the phthalo. I do love phthalo blue, but it can be pretty powerful. So I do wet into wet. I don't put the blue everywhere. I know it'll keep traveling where everything is wet. And I'm tilting my board up and down to get it to softly blend in. After I've gotten it to the area that I want, I stop fussing around with it and just let it dry. You can see the paper buckling even though it's been stretched and it's all shiny, but it will dry flat. As soon as the sky is done, I'm not even waiting for it to dry. I'm just starting right in with the faces. Whenever I paint something that has faces in it, I really want to get them in pretty early on, because if the faces don't turn out, there's really no point in me working to get the rest of the painting done. With the faces, I'm painting my dad with just a touch of yellow ochre and alizarin crimson. And I'm painting fairly wet paint onto dry surfaces. So wet into dry. I'm taking my time dropping in paint where there's a little bit more shadow. And then when it comes time to paint Emma, I am choosing to paint her with Hansa Yellow Light and quinacridone Rose. They're just a little bit lighter, more cheery, youthful colors. Now that I have the first layer down on their skin tones and I'm happy with it, I'm going to go ahead and start in on my dad's pants. So for these pants, I'm using yellow ochre with just a touch of burnt sienna. And to give the shadow areas something a little more interesting rather than gray or black, which I really never use for shadows, on his pants, I'm using just a touch of phthalo blue with cobalt teal, which I really love to use in shadows. I have sped this video up just so you don't have to be bored with every nuance of this painting, but I do paint these shapes pretty quickly. I found that if I keep the outside of the shape accurate, for example, the silhouette of his pant leg accurate, I can really be pretty experimental with the way I drop colors within that shape. So I don't fuss around and I don't go too slow. I'd rather not do too many layers on these colors. And in this painting in general, I will not be doing a lot of layers. Unlike the way we painted the cosmos, which was definitely a slower layered approach. So when I'm trying to get this painting done, or any painting that I do that I'm not considering doing in too many layers, I don't tend to paint much of it in that really watered down consistency that I call weak tea. I tend to paint a lot more saturated mixes of colors, so more along the lines of maybe whole milk. And I drop the paint in pretty liberally, as you can see, into these wet shapes. As long as that shape is wet, I can really keep dropping colors in and not worry about getting hard edges. I let them sort of mix on their own. I am deliberate about where I'm putting the darker hues and where I'm leaving it lighter, just to create a little bit more of a three-dimensional look. Here I'm doing the same thing with Emma's pants. Again, I'm using that cobalt teal that I like, and this time I've mixed it in with a little bit of French ultramarine blue and just a touch of Prussian blue. Again, just having fun with the wet shape and dropping in darker paints where I want more of a shadowy area while the general shape is still wet. As I wait for the pants to dry, I don't really want to do their shirts or their shoes, so you can see me hopping around to paint shapes that are not touching anything that is wet still. This is the next day. Everything is dry. You can see it's flattened out again. And now I'm starting in on painting some details that I couldn't get into yesterday because everything was wet. And this is not much different than what I've already done. I am just going to paint shape by shape. And while that individual shape is wet, I can add darker colors or different colors and let them blend smoothly. One advantage of not painting with too dry of paint is that, as you can see here, I can even sort of outline the boots, and it's so wet that then I can go in with just a little bit of water on my brush and smooth out those darker outlines that I had painted earlier. Because I didn't paint them with paint that was really dry, they're still wet enough and they blend really nice and smoothly with the inside of the boot that I am painting now. I'm not a big fan of painting with really dry paint unless we're talking about the very last few details that I do towards the end of painting a shape or a subject. If you get comfortable with painting with more water on your brush, you have a lot more opportunities. Um, Here I painted that corner first with just water, and then I'm adding my greens, green gold and sap green, to start painting some of the ground color now. Again, as long as the shape I'm painting into is wet or damp, I get these soft blends like you're seeing in the foreground there. Now I'm painting water in the field of grass behind my dad so that I can start dropping in green colors there too. Notice how I hadn't even really bothered drawing in those background shapes of trees, and later I'll probably do some hills in the background as well, which is much more representative of Italy, where my dad and Emma live. But I didn't bother drawing them in. I knew that I would come in later and paint them, and that they would be darker than the sky. Um, it's up to you, I guess, your comfort level of painting without drawing. Obviously, I drew the figures. They're the most challenging for me, and I drew the patch of ground where they are standing. But other than that, there's not a lot drawn on this. Although my dad's wearing a white shirt, I want to give it some shading, and I do love to use blues to put in a little bit of shadows and shading onto white surfaces. Here it's a little bit of Prussian blue with just a touch of French ultramarine blue. Also notice how I'm painting all the way to the edges of the paper. Oftentimes I see students stop short of painting to the edge. I just paint right on over to the edge. I already have the staples that when it comes to matting and framing this painting, I have to cover. So I'm already losing a little bit of my edges there when the painting is done. But if you don't even paint to the edges, you're going to lose even more. So I really encourage you to paint as if those staples don't exist. Go all the way to the edge. Here I'm using almost more water than paint to get my dad's shirt done. I want to be sure it retains the look of a white shirt with a little bit of shadows on it, and that it doesn't go to looking like a blue shirt. As I paint Emma's fuchsia shirt, which is her favorite color, you'll notice that, again, I am painting shape by shape, and I am painting at a pretty milky consistency as far as the water to paint ratio. That allows me to go back in and drop just more darker fuchsia paint and have it blend softly. Now here I'm just adding water to the field of flowers that they will be standing in. I want this to be fairly soft, and I will definitely paint this one in layers, unlike my dad and Emma or the sky, which I'm really trying to nail in just one or two passes. I'm using the same quinacridone rose in the flowers that I used in Emma's shirt and in her hair ribbon. just to keep the colors corresponding to each other, create a little color harmony, but also tie her to the flowers themselves to make that association. This is wet into wet. I'm adding water as I go along and then just adding the first soft layer of color. This area, this flowery area is pretty wet, so I'm going up and starting to think about dropping in a little bit more green in the distance so that it doesn't look like the field just goes on forever, but also actually give it a horizon line. That back green area, the first layer is now dry, so I can come in and quickly, loosely drop in a second layer of paint. I'm dropping this in. The paint itself is pretty wet, but the green patch that I'm painting it onto is completely dry. At this point, I feel like pretty much the whole painting now has a patch of color on it, the first layer, and I am starting to build up my values and my details. Again, I'm going back. Now I feel like I'm circling back around for a second layer on some areas. And I start with the faces and the details there because, again, they're the most important and pretty much the most challenging. I've gotten her hair done, that little shape of hair on that shoulder. So while that dries, I'm finding other areas to work up on middle and darker values. At this point, I am painting on dry paper. Now I'm going to go in and do some detailing on their faces. Their faces are not that big, and so, not much bigger than a quarter. So my goal is not to make it so detailed and so realistic that I'm trying to make them portraits. It just can't be done on that small of a shape in a watercolor that I'm trying to keep loose. So I am painting on dry paint right now, and I just want to suggest the features that are there. I've definitely dialed down my brush to one of my smaller brushes, and the paint is a pretty thick consistency. I would say it's starting to get creamy. For most of this video, I've sped up the footage, or else it could be a really long 4 hours for you, which is about how long it took me to get this painting done. But for this particular section, I just slowed it down to real time because I think it's important to me to show you how meticulous I am about where I put my brush strokes. I'm being fairly economical about it. I want to take my time about at what point and where I'm going to touch my brush to the paper. I don't paint the rest of the painting that meticulously, and so I felt like it was okay to speed it up there. At this point, I've decided it's time to do a little splattering for the flower and the grassy area. So I'm covering up the areas that I don't want to get my flower splatters on. I'm just using scrap paper that I've cut out and just trying to keep the paint off of those shapes for right now. When you do splattering, you want, and this is not splattering right now, I'm just adding some background color for the splatters to come. I'm using quinacridone rose and quinacridone gold, which are just beautiful together. And then I'm going to mix up some paint to do my splattering. And the paint wants to be at least milky consistency. It needs to be wet enough that when you hit your brush or flick your wrist to release it, that the paint will actually drip off and release off of your brush like I'm doing here. The problem is that if your paint is too watery, as it dries, it keeps fading. So you want to get a good amount of pigment in there, and then you also want to get a good amount of water into the puddle before you fill up your brush. The water is needed so that the paint will release off of the brush. It's always fun when it's time to take off the paper just to see, okay, what have I done here and how's it coming along? I'm going in with a pretty wet amount of color to fill in some of those areas. Now that the lightest colors are dry in that area of flowers, I'm going in and putting in some middle values. I'm painting with milk consistency paint onto dry paper. As I add the darks, you can definitely start to see that now it's starting to have some depth to it. I save the darks till last. Remember, you cannot paint light colors on top of dark colors in watercolor. Notice that the farther back I'm painting, the lighter my color is getting. To help us create the illusion of depth, we want to keep the highest contrast colors, the most details up front, and make it fade, get lighter in color as it pulls away from us and less detailed. It's an optical illusion, but it does illustrate how our eyes see things. As I wait for those to dry, I'm starting to paint in some of the last details on the figures, such as the tools that they're holding. Here I'm darkening up a little bit the areas that I think could afford to get a little bit darker. I've done all the lightest colors. I am getting pretty close to being done with the middle colors, and what's going to be left soon is just the last few dark details. I'm darkening up my dad's pants here. still using yellow ochre. Just another layer. It's somewhat watery, but just even coating it a second time is adding a little bit more depth to those pants. And now I'm going in to darken the area of her hair. Now I'm starting to splatter a little bit more on the flowers just to give them a livelier look. I got some splatters up in the sky because I didn't cover it, so I'm just washing them out with water. I didn't really want fuchsia dots up in the sky. The splatters are a nice way to also create a sense of spontaneity or liveliness. And now I'm starting to go in with some darks. For the most part, I feel like the middle tones and the light tones are done. I'm starting to get in with some darks, and soon I'll also give myself some hills in the background. As I add the darks, I definitely leave little holes of the lighter green underneath. I'm not burying everything I did before. I want to see some of those lighter colors underneath. That adds depth to those areas and a little bit more interest. Here I'm starting to add in some hills in the background. My family lives in northern Italy and it's a pretty hilly area, so I wanted to give it a sense of place. As I work the little hills around the back of my dad's head, I'm very aware that how I paint them is also carving the shape of his head. And here it will also carve the shape of his shirt. I like the lost edge between his shirt and the white sky, so I try to leave a little touch of that. Now it's time to really get the darks going and finish this painting. I'm still using the same colors I've used all along. I'm just making them thicker. The green is sap green with French ultramarine blue. Here I'm adding some bluish tones in the far distance. Again, that just helps with the illusion of depth. Atmospheric perspective teaches us that the farther something is, the less detailed it is and the bluer it sort of appears to us. Just laying in that watery layer of blue in that distant flower area has really set that back in the distance. For the last few touches, I'm looking at the shadows. So emphasizing the shadows on my dad's hands, later also on his pants. And I'll definitely come in and give them a shadow that they're casting from the sun, which is behind them. Giving Emma some shadows on her face. At this point, it's all about just figuring out where I can add some touches of dark. I'm livening up some of the colors of the flowers just to give them a little bit more vibrancy. Again, most of the flowers are done with quinacridone rose and quinacridone gold. And here I'm putting in the shadows that my father and my niece are casting. I'm just using a little bit of purpley color, which is made up with that quinacridone rose that's already in the painting, and a little French ultramarine blue, which is already in the painting. That gives a nice colorful shadow that you would not get with grays or blacks. My final touch is going to be to splatter some more flowers into the flower field. One of the most common questions I get asked is, how do you know when a painting is finished? And I know I'm paraphrasing, but I heard a great quote that said, there's no finish line. It's not ever obvious when a painting is finished. An artist has to just choose to stop painting at an interesting point. You could fuss for a long, long time, period. Just decide when it's done and move on to the next painting. I hope you've enjoyed this really quick demonstration of a painting that took about 4 hours. Thanks.